Hi, Jonas.
Hi, Christian. How are you doing today?
Yeah, good.
Good.
Kind of stopping the RC. I'm not happy with that, but
Yeah,
that
I
happened.
already moved that to the first agenda, so we can
Yeah.
discuss a little bit more about that. I also saw like Russell replied, so probably,
Yeah.
but I think Russell will also join this meeting, so let's see.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah. Regular Wednesday.
Hi, Prashant.
Hey,
Hi,
Prashant.
Hi, Christian. Hello.
Hey, Kevin.
Hey, Kevin.
Hi. Good to see you guys again.
You have a note taker now.
Yeah, I'm on recording duty. Russell's on, well, going on break, so
Yeah.
taking over.
For this one, I also have the recording enabled.
Oh, okay.
It's
Already recorded? Great.
Yeah.
Let me add that. Save some bandwidth. Did you do it through Google Meet?
Yeah, I do. So, what tools do you use? That I saw like it's a Phantom.
Yeah,
the name of the product. Okay.
Yeah, it's what Russell was using, so I just used that.
Is that free?
I think so. Yeah.
I can try that out. Because now I still pay for the Google one to record this meeting.
Okay, so you have the paid version. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Everyone.
Okay, since it's 9:05, let's get started. Hi everyone, thanks for joining this Catalog Sync meeting happening every 3 weeks. So since we have a lot to discuss today, let's just begin. The first topic is what Christian has recently raised in the RC verified list, that it's a potential blocker for the current RC in 1.10. Christian, do you want to give more details about that?
Yeah, sure. So the problem is actually quite easy, I guess. So when calculating now the new next row ID for table metadata, we need the number of added rows basically from the client. And currently we have the situation that we removed that field from the spec, which makes sense because all the reasons that Ryan laid out in the PR back then. But currently we have the problem that, well, first of all, in Java, it's still there, so it's still serialized. And secondly, we need to send this to the REST catalog because otherwise the server can't compute the next field, the next row ID. So yeah, I guess open for discussion. I guess this is also mostly a problem for Java and implementation, but also touches a little bit on REST. I'm not sure if this is the right round to do it, but I thought we have the sync anyway, so we might want to talk about this. Yeah, Ryan, yeah, go ahead.
So first of all, sorry for messing this up. I think we should just add it back. So adding a field like this as optional is entirely allowed because it is backward compatible with what we released in V3. I would also be frankly fine with it if we just had a note that said, hey, this was a mistake, please produce it. But we should probably still make it strictly optional, just to flag that there is a very minor possibility that this doesn't, is not produced by a client. I think that allows us to then, continue sending it through the REST protocol to services. Services can use it and then choose what to do if it's not present. They could choose to reject the commit and say, hey, you have to produce this field, or they could go read the manifest list to recover the information. Russell?
Oh yeah, sorry, I was just going to agree. I think I sent this on the mailing list as well. I don't like it. The only reason I'm a little worried about it being optional is I don't want to force REST catalogs to have the fallback of reading the manifest list. And if we're like, that's not actually like a realistic way to do this, maybe we shouldn't say you're allowed to do it. Do we have any catalogs out there who have implemented that yet? Because if we don't, I would say
Can we start with the ground where the table spec says that it's optional, but we require it as part of the REST spec for the update, right? We just annotate in the REST spec, like, hey, if you're using a REST catalog, you need to send this property to the REST catalog.
I mean, that makes, yeah.
It is technically a thing we can do. It does make the table and REST diverge in a very minor and potentially disruptive way, right? If you produce I kind of like how currently if you produce table metadata, you can send it directly to the catalog. But I'm open to that too. I kind of agree with Russell where if we don't think anyone is doing this yet, let's update the spec, say, oops, that was our bad. This is a required field.
I do like Daniel's opinion there as well, because I am thinking about as we move towards the idea of commit protocols, like for the REST diverging from what's actually in the spec, like if we have append REST protocols and things like that, we're going to start getting into this world anyway, where we're like, when you want to talk to a REST catalog, there's some information you may need to send that you wouldn't need otherwise, because when you're on the same JVM, which was like, I think our thought process when we did this change is we're like, we already have this object, why not just pass it through?
Yeah, I agree about that, but now that I think about it, I'm actually inclined to think this is a good idea. And like mostly it's because I think for updating an existing table, we would be okay. But for create table, especially CTAS, like we run into the problem where the client may not produce this field, can send that directly to the catalog. The catalog is then going to be missing this field. Maybe that still works in subsequent updates, but like we do get into this weird position. So I don't know if we want to make the call right now about which way we want to go, but we have a couple options. One is we define it in the REST spec and define what the communication needs to be with the catalog. And the other is we just say, oops, let's fix the V3 spec.
I think I'm still in favor of sending out a thread being like, let's fix the V3 spec and see if anyone is like, oh no, this is going to be terrible. But I think we'll be okay.
I really doubt that anyone is doing anything other than using the reference implementation right now. I mean, because Christian, you're one of the earlier people that would be, actually implementing this, and you found it quite easily. So.
Yeah, the only one I know of is Trino, because they just announced full support for V3. So we may want to just reach out to somebody there and make sure that this isn't an issue for them. But they would probably be the closest.
They probably use the Java. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But still, just like that's the one like production use case that I know of, right?
Yeah. It would be good to reach out to them. We can do that.
Okay. So it sounds like we can.
Quick question to Falco. Are we doing this in the Python implementation, or is this not even like?
No, it's not in there yet. No.
Right.
Yeah. And I noticed it while implementing it in Rust. Yeah. So.
Yeah. There's a lot of responsibility to the engine, and we don't really have a nice way of having to hide these columns. So it's not. Yeah, I think there's no really nice way to do it by Iceberg today. So.
Yeah, so it seems we are lucky we catch this at early stage. So I think we can follow up this with our dev list and reach out to the Trino, which is the only potential user, and we can move forward on that. So let's move to the next topic. It's the add referenced by in the load table response. Prashant, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the referenced by is an additional parameter, which is a query parameter, which will be sending as part of the load table. The intention was to let catalog know more context about in what context the table is being loaded. Is it being referenced in the view? And if it is, then that's the metadata, that's the additional information we are sending into the catalog. And it's now totally upon the catalog discretion on how it wants to use. A couple of use cases that this unlocks. Number one is the definer views. So definer views are the views in which you give a user an access to the view, not the underlying tables. But since you have defined the view as a definer in the definer mode, it can lead the invoker to access the tables via view as long as the view is executed correctly. Obviously, this requires an implicit trust relationship, but that's not the goal. There's just additional metadata that we are sending into the catalog and letting the catalog to decide on what it wants to do. And the other aspect is audit logging. For example, in Snowflake, whenever we produce audit logs, we have a concept of base object and direct objects. So in case if we are accessing a table via view, the base object becomes a view and the direct object becomes the table. So it would help in audit logging too. That's the context. Specifically what we wanted to discuss about what the spec changes, because the spec is pretty straightforward, but there are still some recommendations on it, that whether we should call it referenced by or should we be very explicit and call it referenced by view. The second thing was, should we define a specific 400 error message which gives an information, like for example, I'm doing a load table, but there is no view of that name which I'm sending it part of the load table. Then should I, in the 400, I mean, it's implicit that we send 400, but in the 400 message, should we say that, hey, this is 400 because of this? And the last part was, how do we send back the view name? Because the way we were doing it was the namespace and the view name is what we need to send it back as the referenced by parameter. What should be the separators between them? And that's an additional context. So these are the three questions I basically wanted to bring it up to the community and get feedbacks on. And I have a reference implementation and a spec implementation. Reference implementation is of the client, not of the server, but using Spark. So yeah, that's the context, and open to everyone on what are their thoughts on the 3 open points that that's there in the for discussion.
What was the first one? Is it the behavior if this doesn't exist, or
let's start with the name reference by. Like I don't have a strong opinion of reference by versus reference by view or view reference or something like that. I think reference by is fine. I don't know. Was there any like strong argument for one versus the other than it's just like, well, it's view context? Is there any other scenario in which we think we would use these? I think it would be the same for like materialized views. I don't think that we would like say reference by materialized view or something like that as a differentiator for any reason. So it would just be view reference or oh, sorry, somebody else has a hand up because you're 2.
it's you?
Oh, it's me because it doesn't take down my hand. I'm so used to like these nice features and
yeah, I think my argument is because if we say this is only going to be used by the view, then we could be very explicit, say, okay, this is from view, this is referenced by view. One of the arguments is it's very kind of common that people will misuse certain field, which once they misused, because reference by is quite a generic term. Once they misused, then it's harder to pull it back, unless we think, okay, this is potential for other use cases. So that's my argument. Then we can say, okay, reference by is definitely fine.
okay. So I think I got my hand up before Ryan. I did think of one other scenario that's a future use case which could complicate this, which would be if we had any sort of like transaction kind of management. And then the question is, do we have a separate property or, param for like transactional references as opposed to view references? Because you could say that like, hey, I want to show that this table was accessed as part of a transaction. And so would reference by be used in both? I don't think you could, because you'd also reference a view in that. So then, like, is there any overlap between these, or do we want to narrowly define this as far as views? Brian?
I think that's pretty far out on a limb.
Yeah.
Like I am not convinced that we want server-side participation in transactions like that at all, because that requires putting state in the catalog, and like there are a lot of things to get through before we get to this can be used by transactions. I think that if we narrowly define this as a identifier, right? Because that we would have to say that reference by is some identifier, it should be fine, because then you would have no way of sending a catalog identifier as a or a transaction ID in place of a catalog identifier. That wouldn't make sense. Well, the other thing here is I think that there are potentially other things that might reference these, and I don't see a reason to narrow this name. I'm also not too concerned with people misusing it, because in order for this to be used at all, you need a trusted engine relationship. So I think you have some administrator saying, this engine knows how to use referenced by in order to get to where this makes any sense at all. And so even if people do randomly set it or load it or something like that, it's purely informational and can be ignored unless you have a trusted engine relationship.
And what do we do in the event of nested views? Is there any particular behavior that we want to define? Is it always the top level view? Is it always the enclosing view?
So I think that that is actually a reason to have this on load view as well, because I think you would want to keep that chain. Basically, what would happen is I invoke a view, and then I use that view as either definer or invoker, right? If it is loaded as definer, then when I load the next view, I'm going to load the next view as, with that context, and then I would do the same thing. I don't know that you
Definer
need
versus invoker is a catalog level decision, though. It's not a client decision.
right, but what you would do is I load a view and I say, I load the view within a view. So V1 is the outer, V2 is the inner. I would load V1 and I have no referenced by. I load V2 and I say referenced by V1. I think the question is if you might have a situation in which a view references a view and they're both definer views. And you would need to know that you can transition through the first one to the second one, which
right. So
is awkward.
So that means that you would then need to handle the nested scenario, the load view, the load view could potentially send back a configuration that says, this is what you need to use for loading subsequent things. It's not just, hey, I'm using whatever view I used to reference it, right?
Yes. So this does not affect table right now. So
right.
we could, because table is like, you would have, the view that you're using, the catalog knows whether that's invoker or definer, and then you can get to the table directly. So, however, you might, if you do have this for views, you might want to have that chain. That's a limitation I can live with for now, but we might want to think through that a bit more. I'm curious what other people think.
So I think that the handoff would be when I go to load a view, I load the view, and then I think what we've been thinking is, the client will just use that same view identifier when it goes and loads the tables.
Yes.
But I don't think that that's necessarily fair, because what ends up happening is the catalog needs to decide if loading subsequent loads are based on the definer or the invoker of the view definition. And when I get to a nested view, I need to either be able to use the original view that loaded that, or use the view that I'm loading at that point. So
if you had, if V1 was a definer view and V2 is an invoker view, then you're actually running as the user, as the definer of V1 when loading a table referenced by V2.
Yeah. So then the question is, are we thinking about this wrong? Is this something that the client should be defining, or is it something the catalog should just hand back with a view definition that is used for subsequent loads? And then every load, the catalog can decide whether I give you a new identifier, just an opaque something that the catalog can understand and then translate to either this is the invoker or the definer, and I can change it at every level of reference.
That's actually fair, because what you would do in that case is hand back some sort of token that says this is the thing.
New context. Yeah.
I think what I like about the referenced by is that it is simple and something that the client can do without this sort of handshake. I think, though, that as long as you have the context, which is like, as long as you know, in the simple case, the view name, I think as long as you have the chain of view names that were used to load, you can still use the same technique. So I would probably alter this, if anything, to a referenced by chain, rather than going with a token or state handed back by the server.
Prashant, you get your hand.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more I think about it, the more it goes into the world of like query session context, like what we had in like formation, that the client is maintaining a context in server and it can access it whenever it wants and do the things it required. The nested views is a tricky use case because like I am a definer in both the modes. Which one should I use? It may happen that even though I'm definer, the principle that get invoked by the upper level definer view rather than the lower level has lesser privileges on the table as compared to the other one. So then it goes into the intersection of who has the most privilege, even though both are definer. So
I don't think so. I think you get the innermost definers capabilities. However, the outer definer, sorry, Christian, I know I just interrupted and jumped in. The outer definer would determine whether you can load the inner view, right? So I can load the outermost view and I use my identity to load that view. When I load the inner view, then if it's a definer view, I actually use the outer view's permissions to load the inner view. And if that's a definer view, then I load tables using that definer's permissions to load the tables. So you sort of have this chain. But again, I think as long as the service is past the views in order, right? The V1 identifier, then the V2 identifier, we can get through it. Christian, sorry.
Yeah. So my original hand raise was I just wanted to raise the point that I don't think handing the spec as part of a token would be a good idea. So it should be a separate field. Creating a new token that includes this information, for example, from a view and overwriting this. I know this is how some services worked in the past, but I don't think this is like a clean design. It's also hidden away. So it would be better to have a non-security means of actually doing this. And the second point that I wanted to raise regarding this discussion across like following the trace basically is that if you look at traditional databases, you only need access to the final view, and you don't need access to the whole chain basically. So
that's actually not true. Like Postgres requires that invokers have permissions on all referenced things when you invoke a view. So like it doesn't have the idea of definer-based privileges. So like it's a spectrum implementation. And like, I don't think
be able to simply enable any of these patterns though, right? Yeah. Like if you only care about the innermost view, great. Like you could easily say you can have one and only one definer view in your chain, and it must be the one that references the table. I don't want to care there. I just want to decouple the client and the service as much as possible, and make this something the service can implement any policy on. Which I think we probably need to verify this and maybe write up a couple of the use cases. Yeah. But I think that would be you pass in a list of identifiers, and it works the same way, but now you have that sort of outer to inner reference chain.
Yeah, I mean, like I would say that is probably what I would propose for anybody implementing it if it was a server-side thing, right? So that you don't have to maintain state in the service about like, hey, if I'm creating an opaque token or something like that, I would probably say like, just return the list of tables as it was referenced. But at the same time, I'm a little concerned that making this purely client side is actually limiting in terms of what we could potentially do for views, and because then we're relying purely on just the access chain.
but this doesn't preclude other mechanisms, right? Like we can add other things, but this is saying that we know that it works for chained views if you provide the identifiers. We can come up with another mechanism if we need to later, but I think that this is still pretty clean. So I would go with the reference list. We should give it more thought. Like this is not something to rush through.
Okay.
I think there are other things to think about too, like what the behavior is if you mess this up. That was another thing we need to talk about.
Yeah.
I think I'm agree with the reference chain, which is reference list. You have provide the whole context of the reference, so that REST catalog itself can make that decision by itself. So we don't, like from spec perspective, we don't enforce any behavior in that case.
But one advantage of the token-based approach is that it avoids the question of how do you represent the namespaces. Because then the catalog gets to send back whatever representation it wants to use on subsequent requests. So, and then like really the only difference between what this is that like when you load, what I'm proposing is as a potential alternative is when you load a view, the config tells you what to populate in that reference by field, right? The catalog is telling you what to populate for subsequent calls. And then if you load a view from that, you provide this reference by, and it sends back from the catalog what to populate into that field. It avoids the whole namespace issue.
I think that what you would end up with is just accumulating these identifiers anyway.
Well, it would be slightly different. I would think that you would just like, you would pass back the one that you actually want to use for the subsequent loads, whether it's the definer or the invoker, it would either be the parent or the current one, right?
I would probably, I would definitely opt for just the reference list or reference chain. I don't like requiring this ID to be sent back to the service, and it just makes the view loading, it makes view loading more complicated.
Trivially so. I don't think it really makes it that much more complicated. I think that the bigger question is then like, if we're doing chaining, how do we represent the chaining within a query parameter? Are we doing like a comma separated list of identifiers? Like, you know, we still need to.
So we're underspecified in terms of like how to even represent the identifiers right now. Then there is also the question, the other question of like, you know, what happens if one of the views doesn't exist or something like that. And to me, I think the second question is the easier one, because I think we just provide this as informational. If something doesn't work, you can't use it to open up access. And like if, you know, we ignore it if this is not a, you know, a privileged problem.
I'm sorry, can you explain the concern there about opening up access?
The question is whether we should fail if you send a view name that doesn't exist, or a reference, you know, an identifier that doesn't exist in the catalog. So if I table X and I say this was referenced by view V and V doesn't exist, I mean, I think it only matters if I don't have permissions to table X, right? I would not be able to use the definer permissions of V in that case, right? And so I would say this is purely informational. We don't want to fail if, you know, something that we don't need to verify goes wrong. So that what I meant by opening up permissions is if the permissions for X are carried by a definer view V, then I have to have that and it has to match and all of that. If I don't need those permissions, then we don't even check it.
I don't think that we need to overspecify that though, because a catalog could easily say that if you're passing me a reference, I'm going to validate that it exists. And if it doesn't exist, I think you're doing something wrong and I'm going to throw a 404, you know? So I think the main thing is the security concern of like, you can't load something assuming access if you can't verify it.
So,
right.
Yeah, I agree with you. This, to me, the protocol should not specify what you do in this case. It shouldn't say, hey, you can fail or you can't fail. It should just say, it is up to the server to define what happens.
Sure. I mean, based on what status code it wants to use. If it wants to be strict, it can say 404, and if it wants to be more lenient, it can just ignore it or something of that sort. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, so then the namespace separator stuff, I think we need to come to a resolution on the namespace separator more generally. And we were going to bring this up on the mailing list. I see the comment from Russell about time boxing this. I think we need to fix the namespace separator stuff and then use whatever we determine here. Although having a reference chain definitely complicates that. So we should think through how we are passing these things after we conclude the separator character discussion. Does everyone agree with that? Cool. Okay, then I'll hand it back.
The next is also, Prashant, I think it's also your topic about the read restrictions.
Yeah. So I have so main thing what we wanted to bring up was schema evolution for the read restrictions, and what specifically to know is that the client might be reading a lower snapshot version or a like different schema than what the current table is pointing to, and at load table we don't know what schema the client's intention is to read from. So a normal behavior is that I attach a mask to a column, and till snapshot, let's say snapshot 1, 2, till snapshot 2, that column was there. And then in snapshot 3, the column got dropped, but the mask was still there. So now when I do time travel and when I read the snapshot at 2, I want my mask to be applied to that particular column. In that case, I was thinking that if we send back field IDs, it would be helpful to resolve which column it has, like the column projection rules we have for the Iceberg. So that was the main motivation to bring this discussion up. Yeah. Yeah. Ryan.
Give me a minute. I just was thinking about something else. So I agree with you, because column names could change, and we don't necessarily know which branch or snapshot is being read. We should probably bind to, I mean, unless we wanted to require that the client unbind and, you know, with respect to the current schema, but that's not good. I am a little reluctant to add in the bound references here, just because I think that it is a lot simpler to always have a single reference type, but I don't really see a way around passing a bound reference back.
Well, could you just provide the spec ID? Probably not the spec ID, the schema ID that was used, right? Because I mean, largely we want to make sure that we aren't using the wrong schema or referencing the wrong schema. So rather than.
So the problem with doing that is that we don't want. Okay, so what that would say is like, hey, the current schema ID is 3 on this table. Here are projections for schema ID 3, right? Then if a client is reading schema 2, it would need to go figure out, okay, column A was this ID in schema 3, and then rebind it. So it has to unbind and then rebind all of those terms. So we may as well just send back, here is the column ID that this mask references. That's what I mean by, like, we don't really want to force the client to unbind by going because it would need to bind it to the current schema just to get that ID, and then bind it by ID to the other schema. Like, that's not great on the client side. So I think handing back a column by ID does make sense. This also complicates how to actually pass these back, because we need to produce the same name as the bound expression. So like if it's A in schema 2 and it's X in schema 3, then we need to project whatever transformed value as A in schema 2 and transformed value as X in schema 3.
Precisely. I think that's what we need to be explicitly clear about, because so far it's like a mask of A as a kind of a projection needs to be remapped into saying that, hey, mask of X as like some other schemas Y. That can be different in that scenario. Maybe a structure to represent them as well. Yeah, that I agree. So when we say bound, we are talking about the bound in which we actually capture the field ID, and bound references specifically of Iceberg. Okay.
Yeah.
So can I clarify something real quick? So what we're saying though is that the reason this is an issue is because we get read restrictions at the table load stage, right?
Yes.
And then we don't know where or when somebody is going to be reading, like time travel versus current versus branch. And they could be using any schema. And does that mean then that the catalog needs to provide read restrictions that span all of those dimensions?
I think so, yes. Because the way these things are configured is you set you set them on the table level. So these are table level objects and we don't want to go below that, because we don't want you to set this on the table and then we implicitly say, oh, that was on main, and then like some other branch just doesn't get the updated column mask or something, right? So we want this to be a table level restriction that applies to all branches and all schemas. Russell, we can't hear you if you're.
Your audio is not working for some reason.
Oh, my microphone reset.
Yeah,
Okay.
there you
Yeah, sorry. I'm thinking about the use case, like you have a column that's like social security number and someone renames the field to SSID or something. Depending on at what point you have it, you want that always to be the same column and have the restriction applied. The alternative is then the catalog has to provide read restrictions for all possible renames of this column, which is also kind of weird. I think we have bound expressions, so we should probably just use them, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. We we also have some need to do this for expressions in V4 stuff. I was talking to a Moog recently about this, where if you have an expression that's stored in the table, much like our partition expressions, those are essentially represented as bound because you use the source ID to reference the column. And so I think that we should probably have a representation for sending a bound expression. Part of the problem, though, is we do want to keep these things as simple as possible, which is why we have traditionally not well, I guess we need to look at when we have been serializing expressions as JSON objects in general. I know that we do it for logging purposes and in the like scan metrics API, we'll anonymize something and then send it back. And we can't actually send the bound expression at that point because the types might not match if we have masked things. So we might have to have a expression parser with different modes, or like a bound expression parser and unbound expression parser, in order to accommodate these subtleties. Yufei?
Yeah, I'm thinking about one minor like niche use case, which where invalid even the field ID. For example, you can merge table with the override flag, and potential will still breaks the assumption. For the load with read restriction, it could be fine because we don't assume the clients will catch them. But from the catalog side, if we want to preserve these restriction as a policy or other table properties, then potentially there's one issue for that. But it's a very small case.
Sorry, I thought you had something else, but for that particular case, at least in the reference implementation, we go and preserve the field IDs if we have a field with the same name and type. So, if you do a replace table, we'll try and recover the field IDs and reuse them. So that would work, but also like I think the semantics of column restrictions, if you are also running replace table, like did you drop all those columns and then re-add them? And like I think it is definitely something for the catalog to worry about. And it's a catalog choice whether it keeps its internal representation as names or its internal representation as IDs. But we would say that, if you do keep your representation of this as, column names, then you would need to bind those column names before sending it to the client.
Yeah, precisely to add on that, my expectation was that cataloging will need during attachment capture the field ID as well as the snapshot ID or additional metadata to make sure that it consistently gives back the client the necessary information. So since we are not defining what the policies are, the attachment are, these are implicitly given as a responsibility for the catalog to capture in order to consistently serve the spec point of view. So yeah, just to add more on that front.
Yeah, I think it's more about the catalog tensor because every time we want to preserve this restriction as the other an entity other than the table itself, because every time you set a table, you can actually set everything. Then if these other entity attached to that table, then that should be changed on the catalog side, which does not affect this Iceberg REST spec at all, which is great.
That's kind of why I was hoping to not need to do this binding stuff, to like keep it simple and have only one way of referencing. But I think we should use bound references. So I think we're in agreement on that, so we can probably move on to the next one.
Yeah, so the next topic is the fine-grained metadata commits. Drew, do you want to give us an overview for that?
Yeah, hello everyone. So yeah, it looks like I'm reviving the fine-grained metadata commit proposal again. There has been some discussions around it, and I just think this is a good time to bring that up. So I know yesterday I just posted on the dev list that it'd be bringing this up again, and probably haven't had a lot of time to actually look at the proposal itself. But I think it'd be good to bring it up here for some exposure and see if we're aligning on direction. So as a quick recap, the proposal was left off in a state where the REST API has this like a model to send the fine-grained metadata commits to the catalog, and that was the intentions to say, okay, produce a new snapshot update. But however, in the first proposal, it seems like the goals weren't the best, and the models kind of tracked the Java APIs a little too closely. And lastly, the validation model kind of needs more thought. So now I went back and revamped that design to focus on like the goals of what's actually possible with the fine-grained metadata commits, such as allowing like a lightweight client to write to the Iceberg tables without the catalog actually needing a full library dependency. And that will also give catalogs the insights to what operations are actually happening against that table. And then for the validation model, I simplified that quite a bit after doing the deep dive. I got some feedback to do some deep dive on the validations that are actually happening behind the scenes. And then I also kind of took a step back to say, like, what are the users actually trying to do to their table? And how can I expose like that validation model in a simple way to say like, okay, I'm adding these or overwriting these files, and I only want these files to be updated if these validations hold. And so if you look at the models there, it kind of boiled down to 4 or 5 validations that are applied in a modular extendable way. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
So I'm guessing we don't have enough time to like dig into the details of the doc and everything, but the doc is up to date. Is that fair? So we can go through and comment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, everything should be up to date now. I know it was just last minute, I'm sorry, but I thought it'd be good to bring it up here for a little bit of exposure.
No, I think that's a great starting point, especially that it's been updated and we can go back and revisit. It's been a long time since we talked about this, so.
The validations certainly look more correct now. Yeah. Thanks for the heads up. I think we'll have to, go through the doc.
So let's continue this in the doc review and also the dev main list. So I think we still have 6 minutes for the last topic, which is the donation of the auth manager. Alex, do you want to
introduce? Yeah, I can introduce this one. So just to recap a little bit the discussions on the mailing list. So there has been mainly 2 questions that I think need to be addressed. The first one is, which features exactly do we want? And the second question is more about where do we want them to land? And so Christian chimed in yesterday with very good examples and use cases for human-to-machine flows. And I think that sets the ground for what's really required here. And I do agree that human-to-machine flows, at least one of them, would be a very nice addition. I would also include token exchange personally, because I think it's a flow that is widely used, at least with us at Dremio. So that's the first question. And then the second question was rather about how do we introduce these features? I think we agreed already that it's not going to be like a full donation in one step, but rather chunk by chunk or pull request by pull request. And I agree with that. But the question for me that remains is, where is this going to land? I think some people voiced the preference for including this in Iceberg core directly. I personally prefer this to be a separate artifact. So yeah, that's the second question, and it's open for discussion as well. Ryan?
I have a thought on the second question, which is that I think that it would be confusing to have a migration here unless it's absolutely necessary. So from a user perspective, I would hope that we can extend the existing auth manager and add new functionality to it rather than replacing it and having a situation in which the default auth manager, because we can't really change, the default auth manager easily, just doesn't have certain functionality, and the Venn diagram of functionality has gaps on either side. Like having that complexity of which auth manager do I use, how do I turn it on, why doesn't it support the things the original auth manager did versus why doesn't the original auth manager support things the new one does. I would prefer not to have that complexity, which is why I would say putting these PRs and new flows and capabilities into the existing auth manager is ideal if at all possible.
And
so I agree. Go ahead.
So I want to just piggyback on that. There are a couple other things that came up. Like one is just like the packaging of it. Like we would have to then package in the auth manager to all of the runtimes and everything. And so then we really do have a situation where regardless of whether it's in core or externally, we're including two everywhere. And the last piece is like, I took a quick look after you had updated it recently, and there's a lot of similarities across the implementations, right? So I don't feel like they're just like vastly divergent in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. So in terms of like adding a parallel implementation that is largely very similar to the existing one, as opposed to just trying to integrate new flows into the existing one, I feel like we're just creating a lot of parallel extra work that's going to be confusing to people.
Now that said, I don't think that we have to preserve 100% of the original one and like try and fit a round peg into a square hole. I think we just want to make sure that you can turn on or off functionality in a pretty, I think, smooth way, and try and minimize the rough edges from this transition. Go ahead. Sorry.
So I'm all in for Iceberg core, but I think we need to consider at least two drawbacks. The first one is dependencies. This new auth manager does have some dependencies, and the most important one is Nimbus. So this means that Nimbus is going to be packaged transitively by everybody that is importing Iceberg core. So if everybody agrees with that, I'm fine with that. The second question is more a developer question. So far, the existing auth manager is basically one single class, auth util, with lots of static methods in there. This is not going to be sustainable. We will need to devise something different, probably deprecate that class and go through the deprecation cycle that we do usually. If everybody agrees with that as well, then yes, I'm okay with Iceberg core.
My take is, yeah, let's deprecate what we need to deprecate. It's better to evolve than to have confusion. As far as the dependency, I would hope that there's a way to contain it so that Iceberg core can reference it as an optional dependency, right? If you're not using OAuth and you're not actually loading the OAuth auth manager class, then hopefully it doesn't cause a runtime error if it's not in your class path. But I think that I'm comfortable with, making those calls as we go.
And so I think that the choice around Nimbus may have been motivated by some of the earlier comments of like, hey, why aren't we reusing like some existing OAuth library out there? I would have preferred that we like had an opportunity to kind of like discuss that in terms of like, what does that mean for the Iceberg project here? Because now like we've made that change externally, and there's seems to be like the assumption that that's going to be okay introducing, like we've never looked at Nimbus from, hey, what does that mean in terms of like license and notice, and what are we actually pulling into core? So I think that needs to be part of it as well. Is just like, hey, is that the right choice? I don't know if there are other options or anything like that. But I think that needs to be looked at both in terms of like, what are we drawing in for dependency? And then like, is that always included? Is that something that we can work around? I'm a little concerned about just like how much we're drawing on that versus taking a concerted effort to make sure that we're introducing this in a reasonable way. So
I guess we are out of time, so I'll reply on the mailing list to that question.
hey, maybe it would be
That's okay.
helpful to start with like, I know that there's like a particular user to machine flow, like maybe looking at one and specifically and saying like, well, what would it take to like integrate this and have a little bit of a draft of, well, what does that mean for the dependencies? What does that mean for changes to the library? Like it may be easier than we think it is. So picking a flow that you care about, particularly whether it's Christian or you, Alex, I don't know if you agree on like a U10 flow, but doing something like that might help suss out some of these concerns.
Sure, but we need first to agree on the basic APIs, right? So there's an essential interface there called Flow, which basically you need to implement for any grant. So device code is indeed one of the implementations of Flow, but I think that first we would need to introduce those basic interfaces and project setup and whatnot, and then I would be able to show what device code looks like. If everybody agrees with that, then yes, I can.
Well, but I think what we're saying
That
is
would be maybe two pull requests, one for the basic setup and then one for device code.
What is the setup?
Well, it's like the flow interface. There is the configuration classes as well. What else?
Okay.
Things like that. The runtime that makes the token refreshes and things like that.
Yep, I think let's continue the discussion in the death thread.
Sure.
Thanks for joining this meeting. I will send the recording shortly. Thank you.